Welcome to the Goot Reaction. I'm your host, Joe Goot, and with me is my main man from the Midwest. First, we just wanted to shout out to everybody that's listened to our show so far. The downloads are climbing, and we really appreciate that. It's great to see that someone might be interested in what we're saying out there. So again, appreciate that. Also wanted to mention my Substack again, just for anybody who's interested in more long form articles, random notes, and etc. You can subscribe and get the articles in an email, or you can download the Substack app, and it's thegootreaction.substack.com. So that's another way to kind of delve into what we're putting out there content wise. So that would be greatly appreciated if you could check that out too. So without further ado, let's get into this week's episode. We're going to do another B.R.A.S.S episode. There were a number of things that caught our attention throughout the week, and the main man from the Midwest brought a few things to my attention that looked really interesting, and so we're gonna kick it over to him, and we're gonna switch things up a little bit. Normally, just to give you a little peek behind the curtain, normally I do a lot of the research and kind of I'm not going to say scripting because we don't really script the episodes, but just more of a loose structure to the episodes. And so normally I put that together, and then the main man, Triple M, does a lot of the reaction. And so he's usually at a disadvantage, which is even more impressive than when you think of what he comes up with in response to my rantings and ravings. But at least I have notes to back up my rantings and ravings. So, all right. So yeah, let's kick it over to Triple M and let's get going.
All right, Joe. Thanks. No pressure or anything.
Nothing.
I'm in the hot seat this time. No, it's I have a few loose notes and things I wanted to mention. This, and for everyone too, we mentioned the B.R.A.S.S episodes will kind of feel like what a lot of our more traditional phone calls would have been like. So, where we would each just something would catch our attention during the week, we'd kind of hang on to it and then, bring it up in our conversations. So one thing that I noticed today, which I thought was a really interesting article that I forwarded over to you, it was from The Guardian, and it was an article titled, "The Diamondbacks are facing a climate problem. They aren't alone among U.S. sports teams." And the article went into how they'd like to either modify their existing stadium or perhaps, build a new stadium in order to deal with, for a better experience for the fans. But part of the things that they're really keeping in mind as they do this, given where they're located, is, some of the issues around climate change. And a couple things jump out for me for this article. We'll talk about the climate change one first. And the thing that jumps out to me here is, I get into, being that we follow politics quite a bit and have conversations with different people, you hear the different opinions about climate change, and, there's still people debating about whether it's real or not. Then I see these industries like this. I can tell you, I know some people that work in the insurance industry. They're taking climate change very seriously because, like, the models they used to predict for loss and things like that, they can't rely on them as much as they used to when they're trying to set rates and trying to determine what their exposures are in different areas, because climate change is throwing things off. And so here we're hearing about sports teams, because it mentions in the article too that other franchises are dealing with this as well, that they're trying to have to account for, people's safety, the game experience due to the heat, varying weather. So I just think it's telling to me when, here's an industry that you wouldn't think would, they care about the weather obviously, but you wouldn't think would have this kind of thing on their mind. They have to take it in. And it seems like to me, like it's evidence towards, hey, there must be something to this. So I don't know. If you got a chance to read the article and maybe what you thought about it?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, and this is something that I know you kind of passed along in your note when you sent it along, was sort of the way that they're thinking about handling it in terms of sharing costs with the city or various government organizations within the city and the taxpayers essentially, versus taking on the costs themselves. And so I know that's something that we could dive into here in a minute. But I thought that was a very interesting article because, one, it's very practical, like in your face evidence of dealing with the actual effects of climate change. And And in this case, it's not really getting into the debate of why it is what it is, who's causing it or what's causing it. It's not getting into that. It's not preaching one way or the other, but it's just dealing with the practical impact of those things. And I love how it kind of laid out different parts of this country are dealing with different potential disasters and different concerns. Like the Diamondbacks, obviously the heat is a big piece of that. And then how do you make it more comfortable for the fans? And then obviously tolerable for the players. I mean, if you think about a soccer game, for example, you're running around there for 90 minutes or 45 minutes at a time. And, I wonder if that just where I go in my head is like, do you have seasons start to shift a little bit, in terms of having um, more games over the winter? And I mean, you already in the Premier League, for example, you already have that, but yeah, just wondering like with the MLS, for example, how their season starts in the spring and goes through the summer. Is that going to be tenable for the long term if they don't address that in a certain way? And then you just think the overall cost to try to mitigate that across all the stadiums in the country. Not every stadium would need it necessarily, and some have already been built. They mentioned the Climate Pledge Stadium up in Seattle. How they actually tried to account for that and tried to be net zero carbon emissions, um, pretty much out the gate. So yeah, so I thought it was interesting, and the fact that it does kind of say to your point about the insurance industry having to figure for just the reality on the ground, that they're going to have more losses whether they like it or not, and they just need to really try to figure out ways to mitigate that. So yeah, I think it was a very powerful article.
Yeah, it was interesting. You mentioned Climate Pledge Stadium. It did mention in there that it's named after Amazon's climate pledge to be a net neutral company. And it did talk about the difference between stadiums being proactive or reactive to their issues. So as
Oh
teams
yeah.
look at like new stadiums and they have this in their mind, then they're able to build a new stadium with all that in mind. If they have an existing stadium and they're not in a position to build a new one, then sometimes they're having to react to things um, that are happening. I was trying to skim the article a little bit again here while you were talking, and I couldn't find it exactly, but they mentioned a stadium where there was, they've had flooding problems. You know what I mean? So they put in more
Mm-hmm.
drainage and things like that, but they can't really get ahead of it necessarily as much because it's already an existing facility. The other thing
Yeah.
I couldn't help but note uh, is it mentioned like potentially the politics of the area that they're in as to whether or not they can,
Mm-hmm.
what actions they can take and what they can talk about. Because if they're in an area where it's less, the political climate is less open to talking about things like climate change, then they're not going to boast that they're making those kind of improvements or have those things in mind when they're building the stadium because it's not going to be a popular issue. But that I think that was where they mentioned Seattle in particular is a little bit
Yeah.
more of a blue area. They can make build a stadium with that kind of stuff in mind and definitely promote it because the people are going to
Yeah.
accept it and care about it. So I thought that was a really interesting aspect to that also.
Yeah, especially when you're talking about asking, taxpayers to foot maybe a $500 million bill for renovations and improvements in some of those cases. I think that was with the round the number that they were quoting for the Arizona Diamondbacks project. And they were pushing back, trying to say, oh no, we need to share this cost. It can't be just all on us, the team. And I remember there also being someone in there they quoted, I don't recall who it was, but saying essentially, anytime that's put to the taxpayers to bear the brunt of some or all of the cost of stadiums and projects like that, it's never a good investment. There's never an adequate return on that investment. And but I just wonder though, to your point about what you can or how you can frame it given the political climate in your area, pun intended. uh, you know there's there's a way to break that down probably and saying, hey, if you wear a tank top, do you want to cook sitting in your seat, or do you want adequate air conditioning, or do you want a retractable roof? Do you want all these improvements and stuff? This is, if you want to go to these games and actually enjoy them, it's not a matter of, again, who's causing what or why it's happening. It's just, it is happening. So therefore we need to do something about it. So, but then again, there's always that tribalism around, hot button issues like that. So I think that's just kind of a given. Unfortunately, the way people, a lot of people anyway, will see or filter any particular issue like that.
Yeah, and I think you can shape it just in terms of, it's the whole weather versus climate debate. You can say, hey, it gets hot here in Arizona, therefore we need to do, add a retractable roof or do some things like you're saying, versus saying, hey, we're doing this because of climate change. You know what I mean? It's
Right.
just as simple as how you talk about it. I
Yeah.
think it was one of the maybe one of the Bulwark episodes this week was talking about, if you mention Obamacare, it's terribly unpopular, but if you mention the Affordable Care Act, it's very popular, but it's the same
Hmm.
thing, right? It's just the
Yeah.
language you use to talk about it, you know,
Yeah.
depending on who
Yeah.
you're talking to.
Yeah. Exactly.
Did you have anything else you wanted to mention on the climate piece? Because you set me up with a good segue into the other part that I kind of thought about from this article.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Go for it.
So you mentioned the funding for the stadiums, and you hear about it all the time with whether it's football stadiums or baseball stadiums or anything. The owners kind of basically holding that over the taxpayers' heads of I think one of the most famous stories, remember the Cleveland Browns back in '95 was their last season because Art Modell moved them to Baltimore because the city wouldn't build them a new stadium. And it's
Hmm.
like, why is that necessarily on the city? You're the rich owner of this sports franchise, but yet you turn this back around and make it, that the fans who not only, have to, are trying to support your often terrible sports team, uh, have to turn around and also help you pay to keep the team there, or you're threatening to
Hmm.
move it. Or in that case, he did move it. Cleveland was without a sports franchise, or sorry, a football franchise for 3 years until they came back in '99 into a new stadium, coincidentally. But it just always seemed like a kind of an unfair way to go about that, and it got me thinking. You mentioned soccer a few times. You mentioned the Premier League, and my understanding from the bit of research I was able to do. So if I don't have this 100% right, I apologize to everybody. Please, anything we talk about that you're more interested in or doubt, please look it up on your own as well. Sports in England, for example, let's stick with England, is run way different than it is in the United States. I was explaining this to somebody not that long ago who tends to be, an uber capitalist and uh, sort of more Republican mindset, but didn't understand a lot about soccer. Just definitely didn't understand a lot about the European setup. And I said, really, if you're going to talk about like a capitalistic versus a socialistic structure, England runs, and most countries in Europe run their sports in way more of a socialistic, or I'm sorry, a capitalistic way, because you have like the Premier League, for example. You have 20 teams in the Premier League. Below that, you have another league called the Championship, 24 teams. Below that, you have League One. Below that, you have League Two. I can't remember exactly how many teams are in each one of those. But every year, you play the season, and I know you know this, but I'm explaining it to
Yeah.
everybody. Every year, you
Yeah.
play the season, and the bottom three teams in the Premier League will get relegated down to the Championship, and the top three teams in the Championship will get promoted into the Premier League based on how they finish. And there's a little bit of playoffs involved in some cases, but there's a system where three teams will get promoted, three teams will get relegated. Then from the championship, several teams get relegated down to League One, and several teams get promoted from League One up to the championship. So basically, if you don't do well and you are the bottom of the league, your punishment, per se, is to get relegated down to the next league, where all kinds of factors come into play for your continued success. You're going to get less TV revenue because you're not on the Premier League contract anymore. So that's going to affect your money that you can spend in order to build a roster to be able to try to get you back into the Premier League, per se. So if you don't do well by your own merits and the way you run your business, there is a punishment involved. Over
Yeah.
here, if you don't do well, you somehow get to maintain your status as a team in the elite league. If I'm thinking more football, I don't know. I've heard the
Hmm.
MLS is starting to think about a relegation structure with like
Okay.
the lower league in American soccer. I think it's the USL. I believe is the second tier
Hmm.
in the US. But in like football or baseball over here, like even though in baseball there's a whole minor league system, there's no movement between leagues. It's just,
Right.
it's considered a farm system to develop players up through, but there's no, if you're the bottom of the Major League Baseball one year, you don't get relegated down to AAA. So there's not that same punishment structure for, for not doing well. And in fact, you get rewarded. If you're the worst team in the NFL, you get rewarded with the top draft pick in each round of the draft the next year to do what? To try to make it to try to even things out, right? You were bad, so we're going to reward you with potentially the best player available so that you can build yourself back up. That is not a capitalistic system by any means.
Nope.
That is spreading the wealth around to try to keep parity. You know what I mean?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
I mentioned the Browns earlier. When they moved, yeah, I think they made the playoffs the year before. They had a couple playoff, game in years in the late '80s, but not exactly a top of the league franchise. But yet here they are making, threatening to move if the city doesn't reward them for being a mediocre football team. You know what I mean? With a new stadium.
Yeah.
So when I think about that, and then you get into there's no draft in soccer. It's all, or in I should say, in European soccer. It's all based on your
Hmm.
scouting. You don't get, like I said, the draft doesn't serve as a reward for for poor play. Your finances. There's financial fair play rules, which I think basically says you have to stay within your budget. But I don't think there's necessarily a salary cap to where that's why like
Right.
Manchester City was able to become good in like a short number of years based on infusion of money from the new ownership that took over several years back. Kind of the same with your team, Newcastle, right?
Yep.
They got an
Yeah.
influx of money from new ownership. Um, that's a little different. Also, it's not this like leveled playing field. And then when it comes to stadium funding, and I'll give you a chance here in a second, but when it comes to
Hmm.
stadium funding, I tried to do some research on this too. It looks like there's some government grants available for in some cases, but a lot of times the funding is all based on the ownership and the team, and they'll take loans against like their future earnings. But there's no we're making the taxpayers pay for this, and you're talking about a situation where, like especially in England, the local teams are beloved by their fan
Yeah.
base, and probably potentially maybe would pay a little more. You know what I mean? But I mean,
Yeah.
they're a rabid fan base. If I know a very popular show now, maybe some people have been watching it. Uh, is it Welcome to Wrexham? I think is the name of it. It's about the
Hmm.
team in Wales that Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney purchased, and kind of how they've been able to bring some money in, bring some popularity in, and Wrexham's gotten, I think, promoted the last 2 years in a row that they've been. So
Yeah.
they're up in, I believe, League One now.
Nice.
But the point being, in England, like, because I asked somebody one time that I knew from England, I'm like, who's your team? This was several years ago. I said, well, who's your team? And I expected him to say, because I didn't know that much about it at the time. I expected him to say, oh, Arsenal or Manchester United or something. And they're like, oh, my team's, you wouldn't have never heard of them. They're like a fourth tier, team. And I'm like, well, don't you have like everybody here likes an NFL team pretty much. You know what I mean? Like, but they're like, no, my team's my little club that's from my town, and that's who I like. And so like I said, the fan base there is so much more into those teams even than we are, but yet they don't go to those people to pay taxes when they need new stadium. They do it through their own means and their own revenue. So I said a lot
Yeah.
there. Tell me what your
Yeah.
thoughts are.
Yeah, no. The first thing I thought of was, again, socializing the cost and privatizing the profits. And that's the case in so many industries or examples that you can think of here in the States, where we as a government will subsidize pharmaceutical companies to create new treatments and therapies, and yet we don't see any of the, I mean, granted, people do see the benefit of those drugs, for example, but in terms of actually money coming back to the taxpayers or coming back to the government, they socialize the cost, privatize the profits, and the pharmaceutical companies keep those profits. Same thing with, and again, not in every case, but with the example that we were talking about with the article, the Diamondbacks were saying like, oh, well, we're going to need 500 million, let's say, for these renovations and improvements, but we don't want to foot the bill for it. So what about, putting a extra little bit on sales tax and raising prices on, stadium accoutrements and goods and services at the stadium, for example. And, so they're, again, figuring out ways to like with the sales tax, for example, that's a way to, again, socialize the cost, but then they're privatizing the profit because they're not sharing that back with the community most of the time. So yeah, I just thought that was interesting. And that's very, again, to your example of the capitalist meritocracy versus a more socialist leaning system. It's funny how oftentimes, big business gets the benefit of socialism, but the average person does not. So that's
Yeah,
what
I
I
mean,
think of when when you give those examples.
yeah, I mean, I couldn't help but think. So, like the NFL, for example, you have 32 very wealthy owners. Well,
Hmm.
I guess 31 when you could argue that the Green Bay Packers are technically owned by the citizens of Green Bay. I think there's still a structure in place where
That's true. Yeah.
majority of ownership falls to the people. Um, but yeah, I mean that's socialism in a way for, like I said, 31, 32 rich owners of football teams. And I think back to like the financial crisis back 08, 09. That was kind of the situation we were seeing, right? There was and Jon Stewart talks about this a lot in his, I don't always catch the Daily Show, but I do listen to his weekly show podcast every week. And he talks about that a lot. He's like, you know, in the wake of the Great Recession, we bailed out the owners, right? The wealthy, and we had a pretty slow recovery. And in the wake of COVID, we did it on the demand side, right? We gave money to the people, and while it did probably drive up prices a bit, which is unfortunate, it was actually a fairly quick recovery. And to the fact that, I mean, I don't have specifics on this, but I'm pretty sure I heard the other day that J.P. Morgan Chase came out and said their financial analysis or analysts have said that we pulled off the soft landing, which is basically getting out of that situation, the COVID pandemic situation without a recession, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Surprising.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, like I said, it's just we. I mean, people have made this case before that we really rail against socialism in this country, but when the rich get it, it's doesn't seem to be a problem. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. I mean, in 08, 09, they could have easily decided to, instead of bail out the banks and the CEOs, and while everyone over there on that side's getting bonuses and stuff, people have still lost their houses. And people were, I mean, there were massive widespread effects from that, at the ground level. And then obviously there were a lot of job losses along with that as well. And they could have just decided to go for a bottom up approach, and they didn't. And that would have gotten money into the banks back into the banks, but then also allowed people to stay in those homes, or at least long enough to restructure things and figure out a different situation instead of just getting kicked out. And I think a lot of that has to do with, Obama was the change candidate, hope and change, and yet he stacked his cabinet and his financial advisors and stuff with Goldman Sachs and Bears and Stearns people, like, so are we really surprised then that that's how that worked out? I got a lot of good stuff to say about Obama, but I think that was a huge miss.
Yeah, but I mean, I agree with you, but also like a lot of those decisions were made about what that was going to look like before he even took office or really had a chance to exert, a lot of sway over it, necessarily, but he didn't also pivot too much when he would
Right.
have had the chance. So
Right.
yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think part of that too, you mentioned some of his choices there was he was the hope and change candidate, but he also seemed to not really want to rock the boat.
Mm-hmm.
He came into a lot of negotiations and things with a very middle ground approach, and I think that really kind of hurt him in terms of being able to get a lot of the change and stuff through that he probably wanted. And, think about the healthcare negotiations. He came in and
Yeah.
said, "Hey, Republicans, here's a healthcare plan that you've already said you like." You know what I mean? It was a proposal you had previously done. It looked a lot like what Mitt Romney had passed when he was governor of Massachusetts. Here, we can all agree this is good, right? Sign here. And they're like, no, 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 no. You're staking that as your position, so we're going to take the position all the way on the opposite far side of that as we possibly can in order to
Mm-hmm.
not give him any kind of win whatsoever. And what he should have done is come in with the farthest left possible plan he could and make the Republicans meet him in the middle. You know what I mean? But no, he started in the middle, which allowed them to move the middle,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah. No, great point.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I was going to go somewhere with one of those points a minute ago, but I can't remember. So maybe it'll come back to me.
All right. Right on.
Um, yeah. So I mean, one of the other headlines that jumped out to me recently was the Bob Woodward's new book's coming out called War, and I think everybody probably saw this was that apparently, according to information he was able to get from a former Trump aide and then confirmed by the Kremlin, which, okay, well, it's the Kremlin, so trust that, I guess, as much as we want, but that during the height of the pandemic, the early parts of the pandemic, he sent COVID tests, and I've seen it written a couple different ways: COVID tests or COVID testing machines to Vladimir Putin, and not to the Russian people, but literally to Putin. And I would just like to throw the question out there for all people that think this guy should be our president again. What exactly is America first about that? Okay. People at the time here couldn't get their hands on COVID tests. I had heard they existed, but I had no idea where to even possibly think about getting one. And our president sent those tests to the president of Russia. So again, I say, what exactly is America first about that?
Makes you wonder. Makes you wonder. Almost like it's just a slogan. Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, and I think back to some of the reporting too, where, I mean, he was actually so divisive during that time, making it a blue state, red state thing.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't going to help people in blue states. Tried to pin it on blue state governors when uh, COVID actually, it was spreading in New York and some of the bigger cities early. So he tried to turn that into a blue versus red thing. Again, everybody, what exactly is America first about that?
Yeah.
I mean, his just personal quest for power and ambitions. Just, I mean, he showed us who he is every possible chance he gets, and yet some people just don't seem to want to look. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's also just so plain how desperate he is to be liked and loved by by the elites and the dictators around the world. I mean, I'm sure he thought he was doing Putin a favor and really trying to build some street cred with Putin. And I've heard some other analysis that I think maybe it was Cenk over at the Young Turks, where he wasn't as concerned about it because he felt like maybe that was just a way to negotiate, essentially negotiating like a trade deal, because we were getting some other things from them, like ventilators and things like that. And he felt it wasn't as big of a deal, but I think both things can be true. I think he would have done it even if there wasn't any kind of stuff coming back from Russia. I think he would still have sent that stuff over there and have been so desperate for Putin to give him an attaboy and pat him on the back and ruffle his hair and say, "All right, that's the way to do it, big guy." That's all he's looking for, is that validation from the world's biggest, dictators and elites, and billionaires and stuff. So, yeah, it's not surprising that he would go that route.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that about the potential for a trade, that there might have been some trade type stuff involved. But as you say that, I think about, again, reporting that I remember hearing at the time, which was the governors were basically left on their own to try to get supplies that they needed, whether it was ventilators, masks,
all the PPE stuff.
Yeah, all that stuff. After, Trump had basically, when he came into office, shut down the, pandemic preparedness unit that had been started under, I believe under Bush, because I think he did that in reaction to, was it SARS at the time? I think maybe he
could have been. I know Obama was utilizing that for the Ebola stuff in Africa as well. That played a big role there.
Yeah, but I think the initial realization of a need to have that kind of stuff and be ready I thought I remember hearing it started under Bush, but
okay.
But so we didn't have the supplies we needed to be ready, which I get. That stuff's hard to prepare for. But we'd had a lot of warnings from various doctors and people, and I know Bill Gates, oh my God, the devil, Bill Gates, but he had, from some stuff he had done with some of his, nonprofit organizations, had predicted something like this was coming. We weren't ready. Governors were having to get supplies on their own. And then I remember hearing, and I'm sorry, I don't have this documented well, but I remember hearing situations where governors were managing to secure this equipment, and then it was literally getting intercepted by the federal government and taken. And then I remember one point where there was a conversation about ventilators or something, and Jared Kushner at the time made the comment the federal government couldn't give those to the states because those were ours. Whose is ours? The federal government is representative of the country, and it should be working to go wherever it's needed. You know what I mean? So I hear stuff like that, and you hear about, and I'm going to divert a little bit here. You hear about, how Trump had to be talked into sending aid to California when there was wildfires. He literally had to be shown that Orange County had a lot of Republican voters in it, almost more in Orange County than in the state of Iowa, before he would react and send aid to California. But then this guy has the balls to go down around North Carolina and places like that and claim that the Biden administration and Kamala Harris are not helping them, because it's a red area. That's what you did. That's not what it sounds like is happening down there. When even the Republican governors in those states are saying, no, the Biden administration has been great. FEMA's been great. They're giving us exactly what we need. That just, I don't know. Come on. Come on, people.
Yeah, that's that ultimate, again, that projection every time or also the every accusation is a confession kind of thing in those cases, right? Where there's some just outrageous accusation or assertion that Democrats are doing something nefarious, and it's like, oh, well, if you just look back, either it's something he said he would do or something he actually has done. Like in the case you're talking about, yeah. And the fact that he's still saying even now that he'll do it again, which is funny, of course, considering that it's stuff that he's already done, so it's not like a new thing. I mean, there's a track record of him being petty and belligerent when it comes to people's lives and property and stuff. So yeah, pretty pathetic.
Yeah, it's like it'd be crazy enough if you're like, how could this guy think of all these things to lie about and accuse people of? And then when you go back and go, oh, well, no, it's because usually it's something he's actually done. You know what I mean? It'd be crazy enough to just think he could come up with all these things to pin on somebody. But no, he actually did most of them. Um,
Yeah.
but so that kind of leads into, I don't know if you got a chance to listen to it all, but I forwarded you that episode of the Armchair Expert, which I
Mm-hmm.
think it
Yep.
just came out actually today or maybe within the last couple of days. It was with Michael Morris, who was a how was that termed, a cultural psychologist, and the episode was on
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
tribalism. And I just, when we're having this kind of conversation, I think about that, like that tribalism mentality, and I think they said the last chapter of the book was on this toxic tribalism, where like you can't think outside of your tribe, and not only you're part of your tribe, but you have to like hate the other tribe. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm paraphrasing a lot there, but did you get a chance to listen to that
Yeah,
episode?
I was able to finish it. I probably didn't absorb it all because it was there were a lot of rapid fire examples there, and I was doing a couple other things at the time. So yeah, I probably need to re-listen to that one. But I caught some of, especially what you're talking about now with the tribalism aspect and how it can cause people to just ignore reality, and they don't see the truth. All they see is the tribe, and so that can cause them to yeah make decisions or listen or not listen to certain people or certain things just based on the label attached to it and or who's saying it. So yeah, that was an interesting episode.
I thought he touched on some interesting things in it too, because he was talking about like our species in particular versus some other animal species. We're very um we're well, like use the example ants. He said an ant hill. I can't remember which areas he talked about, but an ant hill in one part of the country is going to behave the same as an ant hill in another part of the country, right? The species is just uh, predestined, kind of by their nature, to do what an ant's going to do, right? But he said people are very subject to how they are raised in the community they're raised in. So I think you could probably see that with like in a lot of cases of like adoption and things like that, where somebody of a different background is raised in a particular community, and then they take on those tribal cultural traits of the community they were raised in, which is kind of really that that nurture aspect. So I thought that was interesting, and it kind of talked about like how then based on that your reactions to certain things might be somewhat not predetermined but very influenced by that cultural upbringing. And then it made me think to our free will episode, which if people haven't listened to that, please go out and check that one out. But just how much, again, the free will episode, Robert Spolsky talked about the idea of, do we really have free will, or are we just, predetermined by um, our our previous experiences ourselves, but not only the previous experiences of former generations and stuff. And so it's just interesting how some of these topics all kind of, they didn't mention that in this episode, but it makes me think they all kind of touch on each other a little bit.
Yeah, that's a huge part of that. And again, the intertwining of nature versus nurture. And I think the one big note that I had from the episode was around like how yeah, just to piggyback on what you're saying there, that cultural and political bias is kind of inherent. If you grow up in a conservative household or around conservative people, you by the time you start forming your own opinions or even beyond that, and you start, let's say you hear something about, or you read a story in the news that says something about a government expert says X, Y, or Z, and you may have already enough of an inherent bias against whatever that expert is saying because you don't believe the government could be trusted, because you grew up around conservatives, and oftentimes conservatives are the ones that are rallying against government and saying it should be small, it should be out of the way, it shouldn't have any influence in our lives, it should be, small enough to drown in a bathtub kind of thing. So just being, being in an environment can lead you to automatically have trust issues with certain institutions, or you think about uh, educated experts and things, not, so you got the government on one side, you've got elite, the elites, quote unquote elites, that from these major universities and stuff, that are also then experts, but then certain people are just predisposed to ignore the expert opinions and say, "Oh, they don't know me. They don't know what it's like to grow up in my shoes, and so I'm not going to pay attention to the science. I'm not going to listen to the expert opinion." And a lot of that's from that early upbringing around those, other certain ideas. So,
Yeah, I think that upbringing definitely comes into play, and then especially during COVID, we saw this like really death of expertise in the sense that people stopped
yeah.
trusting experts, and that actually takes me down a little bit different path than too. And I'm thinking back to something you mentioned in a previous episode too, where you mentioned your Catholic upbringing and how your Catholic upbringing, but the freedom your parents gave you to read different books and explore different things, and then your natural curiosity took you into down some different paths, and probably backfired on your parents a little bit, that it made you turn away from Catholicism or religion altogether, but it makes me think too, something else we were kind of talking about as the week went on, is the idea of like critical thinking versus belief. And I would say it doesn't have to be a versus, but it always, one thing I think one thing you and I do really well is critical thinking. I mean, I think that's the
Hmm.
genesis of this whole thing we're trying to do here.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But I see so often where belief gets in the way of that, and and like I said, they can go hand in hand. And I'm not saying critical thinking should necessarily override beliefs, but it could supplement it. I don't think beliefs should be something that stop you from being able to think about something critically. So, like you mentioned, the folks with a conservative upbringing and sometimes being resistant to some of those things. But any single situation, I'd like to think you should be able to take in the information about that, and then you know, like I said, apply critical thinking to it, and maybe change your initial stance. You know what I
Hmm.
mean?
Yeah.
And
Imagine that.
because I think about this a lot with the idea of like, well, when Trump was on trial, and the conversation around the jurors was, well, are they a lefty jury or a juror? Are they right? Do they watch Fox News? Do they do this and that? It's like, is anybody asking the question of, could that individual put all of that aside and see the evidence and apply critical thinking and just literally go, well, I think he's guilty or he's not guilty, or every person is going to bring their bias into it, their belief system, their belief that Trump is a god king or he's a buffoon. That's going to have to affect their decision. And there's no way they can possibly just look at the facts, apply critical thinking to it, and make a judgment. Because if you're telling me that people can't do that, then you're basically saying nobody is trustworthy to just carry out, that function
Right.
and let the facts rule. So that's a very troubling sentiment to me that, you know,
Hmm.
like I said, that's the situation a lot of people think we're in.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think about that in the way that really you shouldn't have any beliefs without critical thinking leading up to it in the first place. I mean, I think all of us have some, I don't know if instinctual is the right word, but maybe some snap beliefs, or maybe more beliefs based on feelings. I think we're all susceptible to that. But I think any strongly held belief should come out of critical thinking instead of, you know, any other path, really. I mean, even if it's based on feelings initially, if you can critically analyze those feelings and figure out why your emotions are telling you a certain thing or why you feel a certain way, applying critical thinking skills to those feelings, to those thoughts. And if you still feel the same and if you still believe the same afterwards, then that's fine. Then you got there, but you went through a process. And so I think that's, to what you're saying, I think that's the critical two-step process there: critical thinking, then belief.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's a great point there. And I've had a few conversations with people over the years where I've probably rubbed them the wrong way a little bit when I've told them that, well, I think beliefs, kind of to your point, are ultimately a choice.
Mm-hmm.
So, and where it usually gets to be a hot button issue is when you're talking about like LGBTQ. I hope I got those in the right order.
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Issues, and a lot of religious people want to say, well, that's a choice, that's a lifestyle choice, and it goes against my beliefs. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, my opinion is that your belief is 10 times more of a choice than that person's sexual orientation because
Mm-hmm.
they are born that way, to quote the great Lady Gaga. No, I'm kidding. But, and when I think of like religious beliefs, and again, hey, if people have religious beliefs and they're well thought out and they're well intentioned and it leads them to lead their life in a good way, then more power to you. But it's a choice to me in the fact that you're born and you know nothing about the idea of God or anything. And at some point in your upbringing, your parents take you to a church, and there's however many different denominations out there of just Christianity alone, much less some other religion, and it's whichever one they have adopted as their own by choice, and they take you there, and then often this would be my one argument that's maybe not a choice is they sit there and basically tell you that, I'll paraphrase, but if you don't believe, you're going to go to hell. And so they frighten you as a child into, into believing these things. And
Yeah.
then that's your belief system going forward. Now you have a choice as to whether you accept that and believe it. And in your case, you applied critical thinking and curiosity and made a choice,
Yep.
right? But a lot of people don't because they're scared. But just that whole path, like you're choosing to accept all those things, and a lot of times you're a kid, so maybe you don't know any better, but you're choosing to
Yeah.
accept all those things as the way. I remember thinking that when I was younger and going to getting taken to church and stuff too, which I never really wanted to do, but like, hey, mom and dad, what are all these other churches about? Like, how come ours is this way, and like, how come we're not all just one big Christian church? Like, what are all these differences? What are all these like made up differences between all these denominations and stuff? And it's like, well, we're this and this is why. And it's like, okay, so we're like choosing to be this denomination versus this just never made any sense to me. So anyway,
Yeah.
long roundabout way of saying I think that is way more of a choice than like sexual orientation. No one's
Yeah.
choosing to do those things just because of some influence or it's
Right.
how they're born. So people should think about that. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. And yeah, it makes you wonder then. Because I think empathy goes a long way in those types of discussions or in those types of thought experiments too. If you inherently have empathy, then you're inherently willing to think about things from other people's perspectives, to put yourself in their shoes for a minute. And if you can't do that or you're unwilling to do that, then I think it's much easier to just judge and then move on or dismiss someone's experience, however similar it might even be to your own, if it's different, or if you think it's bad, or some book tells you that it's the wrong thing. Oh, if you don't have empathy, then it's easy to believe it and move on and just judge and be good with it. So I think a lot of it comes down to that.
Yeah, empathy and perspective. I mean, just the inability. You gotta. If you haven't walked, it's the old saying, right? You don't judge someone until you walked a mile in their shoes or whatever. I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot to that, and it's not always the case that you can truly have the same perspective as someone else, but you should at least, open up your mind, open up your heart to say, hey, maybe I don't relate to their experience exactly, but I understand what pain is or loss is or confusion is or struggles, and I can just like you said, express that empathy to other people. Another podcast episode I'm going to reference here goes back a couple weeks. It's Work Life with Adam Grant, and he's was talking to Sarah Silverman,
Hmm.
and she was just talking about some different experiences she's had out in society recently and how sometimes they've been confrontational, and she's trying to just kind of approach everything with kindness. You know what I mean? Like she was mentioned, there was an incident where a little bit of a fender bender or something, and she actually didn't think she hit the person, but he was claiming he did, and he was all mad, and she just like, hey, let me buy you a coffee or something like that, and just kind of,
Hmm.
it was something along those lines. Just settled it with with kindness, and it's just like, we could go a long way if we kind of implement those kind of things. But
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's that the general outlook again, right? It kind of ties in with empathy. It ties in with, just some patience and perspective and just how you approach things. Do you wake up and choose violence that day, or do you wake up and choose tolerance and understanding and patience and kindness? And I think a lot of those, going back to again belief and choice and applying critical thinking, you can, if you have a little bit of patience in any situation, that gives you a second to think critically about how you want to proceed, and then that gives you many more options to say, instead of going at this and being aggressive and just letting your emotions take over, going at it from more of a thoughtful perspective and leading with empathy and understanding. I mean, I think that's literally, we have a series of choices like that at every given day. So yeah. All right, cool. Well, I mean, I think those were all great and interesting stories. I'm glad we got a chance to discuss those. And, for anyone out there, if you feel like leaving a comment or giving us a rating after you listen to an episode or two, we'd really appreciate it. And again, thanks for all those who have checked us out so far. Really appreciate it. All right. Well, we will see you again next week. And until then, have a great week.